Welcome friends, welcome back to the kitchen. Coming up over the next little while, I've got some recipes that I want to make that use puff pastry. Normally, up until about 2 years ago, I would have just gone to the grocery store and bought puff pastry in the frozen food aisle. There was a brand available to me in our market here that was made with butter, 100% butter. I could read and understand what all of the ingredients were, and it tasted good. A couple years ago, I go to the grocery store, I buy the same brand, I bring it home, and I noticed that they've taken the word all off of the package where it used to say all butter, and they've added in a little tiny print underneath butter the word flavor. They stopped using butter. Cost-cutting measure, I guess. They certainly didn't pass any of those cost savings on to me, the customer, and it tasted horrible. So I decided to start making puff pastry. And I did a lot of research. I pulled out a lot of my old cookbooks. I went back to one of the cookbooks I have written by Robert May, published in 1685. I'll pull it out later and we'll look at it. I looked at Larousse Gastronomique. I have copies of that in French from the 1930s. And I pieced together a recipe that I think works really well. So, in the stand mixer, I have butter and flour. Okay, so there's two parts to puff pastry. There is this part, the beurrage, which is, the butter part, and there's the Détrempe, which is the pastry part. And the pastry part is kind of similar to pie dough. And the beurrage, it changes through time. And so the beurrage that I'm making today, I'm going to call it mid-classical. So this is The Accomplished Cook, written by Robert May. This book, the one I'm holding in my hand, was printed in 1685. And I went back to this book because Robert May was English. But as a child, his master, the woman of the house, the master of the house, sent him to France to learn how to cook French because all of the extravagant English households in the 1600s had French chefs. She wanted to train her own French chef. Sent him to France, he learned how to cook, he came back, and he ended up writing this cookbook. So I was looking at that because I wanted sort of a 1680s perspective on what this recipe was like. Wouldn't you know it? A 338-year-old cookbook, that page is missing. There's 2 pages that are missing. And on those 2 pages were 5 recipes for puff pastry. So I went back, and luckily there are complete copies out there. I went back and I looked at the recipes. And so none of the recipes have this step of mixing together the butter and the flour. This beurre manié, or kneaded butter, kneaded with flour, happens later. This happens in the 1800s in France. And this 1938 Larousse talks about this method as the ancient method. So it appears in the 1800s and then it disappears again because in today's day and age, 2023, you don't see very many people doing this step. They pretty much only use butter. They don't put the butter in the flour. The butter in the flour makes it much easier to roll. Okay, now we're going to take the butter. It's slippery. It's going to slide all over the place. I have an 8x8 cake pan and I've lined it with plastic wrap. I'm going to take the beurrage part and we're going to put all of the butter into this, shape it into a square, wrap it up, and stick it in the fridge. So I'm making a fairly large batch today, almost 3 pounds of finished puff pastry. And I'm doing that because nothing that we're doing today is very difficult. From a technical standpoint, nothing we're doing is that hard. Nothing we're doing is that exacting. But it's tedious and it's time consuming. There's a lot of time in and out of the fridge and rolling and so on. So I tend to make a big batch and then it freezes. It freezes incredibly well. So the next step, wait a sec, because I'm dealing with 4 cups of flour, I decided to bring out the bigger mixer. So into this mixer, 4 cups of flour, and I'm just using all-purpose flour here. Couple tablespoons of sugar, couple teaspoons of salt, and some butter. And we'll just get that on and start mixing. So I'm using all-purpose flour, and this is one of the few times you'll ever see me use unsalted butter. Here's the deal. If I was making savories with this puff pastry, like, I don't know, sausage rolls, something like that, I'd be using salted butter in here, and I'd still be putting the salt in there because it goes together with the savory. If I was making this and I only had salted butter at home, I would leave those 2 teaspoons of salt out because I know here in Canada and in the United States, the salt content of butter is regulated. And the most salt that a pound of butter can have is roughly equivalent to 1.5 teaspoons. But most butters come in at 1 teaspoon of salt per pound of butter. It's really easy to calculate and just leave that salt out if you're using salted butter. It's not a big deal. And I gotta tell you, anytime I've used salted butter and I've served it to guests, no one has ever said, oh, you used salted butter. So now I've got a cup of water here. Put in an egg yolk. Egg yolks are very old. All of the recipes from 1685 had an egg component. I'm adding some vinegar. Vinegar is something that starts to make an appearance in the 1800s, and it tenderizes the dough, makes the dough much more tender. And there's a very famous lard company here in Canada called Tenderflake. On their pie dough recipe, on the side of the box, egg yolk, water, vinegar. And so all of that goes in, and we want to mix this to a nice, smooth, consistent dough. So this is a step that if I was making 1/3 of the amount of dough that we're making today, I would do this in a food processor. Totally do this in a food processor. You get a much nicer dough. But because I'm making such a large batch, the stand mixer is your second best choice. So there we go. Put down a little bit of flour on the bench, not that much, just enough so it doesn't stick. And I just want to pat this out into kind of a square. I had to run inside the house to get plastic wrap, something I don't really use all that often. And yet today, in today's episode, you have probably seen me use more plastic wrap than you have in the last 2 or 3 years. So I'm going to wrap this up. This is going to go into the fridge with the beurrage. They're going to chill about a half an hour, and then we'll move on to the rolling and folding. So let me introduce you to my little friend here. This is for conditioning clay slabs if you're a potter. I don't really know anything about pottery. Nothing about pottery. What this machine is actually used for, how you're conditioning clay, completely escapes me. 2005, Julie and I are in Tokyo. We're hanging out in this little tea shop, having one of the best, if not the best, croissant I've ever eaten in my entire life, and I've eaten a lot of croissants in my life. And I noticed that the baker was using this as a dough sheeter to sheet the dough for croissants. And I thought, oh, that's a really amazing little machine. And when I came back from Tokyo, I wanted to get one. And so I started looking at dough sheeters, and dough sheeters are incredibly expensive. And I couldn't find this machine. All of the words that I was using to try to find this machine, I couldn't find it. until a friend of mine said, oh, that's a clay conditioner. You should be looking at pottery stuff. Why do you want this for dough? And so I searched this out. I found it, bought one, 2006, bought it, boom. Started using it, love it, absolutely love it. And so when I started looking around, I realized that, someone, don't know when, don't know where, looked at this machine for clay and said, oh, this is a cheap, relatively inexpensive option versus actual croissant dough sheeters. And they started using it. I think it's great. And you can find, from the dawn of YouTube, people actually using it to roll out croissant dough or Jamaican patty dough. That's an amazing one too, to use on this. And then, I don't know, 4 years ago, there's another channel here on YouTube, a French guy named Alex, and he tried to design a croissant dough sheeter. And the whole time he's designing his machine, I'm looking at the screen screaming, Alex, it already exists. What you're looking for is already out there. It's used in the pottery world. So, let's see. It goes through. For these first few rolls, really what I'm trying to do is roll out a square that's roughly twice the size of our beurrage. So, you don't have to be precious with the dough. I think one more roll. Okay, now we take the butter, the beurrage, and we unwrap it. And we put the beurrage on at an angle like that. And then we fold in our pastry. Fold in our pastry. You're going to close it like an envelope. Now, you absolutely don't need this machine. I will link to a video of me, 5, 6 years ago, making croissants. And croissant dough is exactly the same as this, except croissant dough has yeast. But otherwise, the method, exactly the same method. You're putting in the butter, you're rolling it, you're folding it, you're building those layers. This just doesn't have yeast. Otherwise, pretty much exactly the same thing. And I do that by hand. In that video, did it by hand because I wanted to show people that you don't need any fancy tools to make it work. It's a really simple process. You just have to have the time to do it. So, now we roll this. We want to roll this to our first fold. And with this roller, I don't really need to use much, if any, flour. If you're doing this with a rolling pin, flour is really important so it doesn't stick to your bench, doesn't stick to your rolling pin. The most important thing, I think, for this first step, for this first roll and fold, is to make sure that your beurrage and your Détrempe are roughly the same temperature and your beurrage isn't too cold, that it's still pliable. Now, adding the flour, making that beurre manié, certainly helps with that. So, I'm going to roll this out until I get the full length of our roller, and then we'll do our first fold. Okay, so this looks great. Now we do our first fold. I like to fold 3/4 of the way, fold back 1/4 of the way, and then fold over there. At this point, I'm going to do one more roll. You know what? On second thought, I'm not going to do one more roll. It's a little bit warm here today, so I'm going to wrap this up. I'm going to use the plastic wrap that I've already got out here, wrap it up, put it back in the fridge at least 2 hours before we do the next roll. And this is the thing about the pastry. It really isn't all that difficult. Even if you're doing this with a rolling pin, a little bit of flour on your counter, a little bit of flour on your rolling pin, keep it so that it doesn't stick. Brush that flour off before you do the fold, because now you want the pastry to stick together. So you got to brush that flour off. You don't want to introduce extra flour. Put it in the fridge, and it's a waiting game. So this is something that, you could take 2 or 3 days to make, and it'll be just fine. I wouldn't worry too much about that. Into the fridge. The rest of the operation is just repetition. Roll, fold, chill. And I'll do that 4, maybe 5 times. This is my last roll of the pastry. And there's this arms race online of how many folds can you do? How many layers of pastry can you get? Can you get 1 million? Can you get 10 million? All of that's pretty great. It's fun, makes for a great thumbnail. Problem is, the thinner your layers, the less puff you're going to get later on when you go to cook it, because you make the layers too thin. So that's one of the pitfalls. Don't try to get too many layers right off the bat. Figure out how many folds works for you. Don't let the dough get too warm. You don't want the butter to melt. If the butter is melted and you're trying to roll it out, you won't get the layers and you won't get the puff. That's probably the only pitfall with making this. Now, put a little flour on this board, and we'll transfer our pastry over. Now, that's a lot of puff pastry. I don't need it all today. I don't need it all this week. I don't need it all this month. Great thing about it is you can freeze it. I'm going to cut this into probably 4 pieces. And when I rolled this out this time, I ended up with a rectangle, sort of a broad rectangle. I should have had a longer rectangle. Makes it easier to portion. One of the things you don't want to do, which I'm going to end up doing here, I know, it'll be okay, is you don't want to have a cut end exposed the next time you roll it. You want to always put your cut ends in so that when you fold it, they're not exposed, because you don't want to lose the butter out the side. Not going to happen for me, so let's just see. I'm going to take this much here, and I'm going to use this today, and we're going to make a little something with that. Okay, so 2 of these are going into the freezer. These 2 are going to go into the freezer. This one, I'm going to make sausage rolls, so keep an eye out for that one. It's just going to go into the fridge because I'll probably do that tomorrow or the next day. And this little piece, we're going to make pommier for an after-dinner treat. So, roll this out a little bit. So there we go. I've got it kind of a nice square. I could have used the machine to roll it out. I do like to play with the rolling pin just to make sure I can still do it, because that was a pretty wonky shape. But I've got a nice square at this point. Now, I'm going to take a little bit of white granulated sugar and I'm going to spread it over. A little bit of cinnamon. And a tiny little bit of salt. I'm going to take my rolling pin and I'm going to press that in. I'm going to flip it over. You're going to lose some. You are going to lose some. Don't worry about it. It's all on the board. And I'm going to put a little bit more on. And then the same thing. A little bit of cinnamon and a little bit of salt. Not too much, just to give a little bit of contrast. Do the same thing again. We'll try to roll it into the pastry. I'm not trying to roll the pastry out. I just want to roll the sugar and the cinnamon into the pastry. Then fold in, fold in, fold in, fold in, and fold like that. And then we'll just cut them pick up a little bit of the cinnamon, sugar, and salt that's on the cutting board before I put them onto the baking tray. Just to get a little bit on each side, on the ends, and then onto the baking tray they go. The oven is preheated to 450 degrees, and once I get all of these onto the tray, we'll stick it in the oven and bake them off.
Hey, Glenn. Hey, friends. Ooh, those look really good.
Okay, so
Those are super puffy.
so much puff. You're never going to get that much puff from a supermarket puff pastry. Now, it did take me a couple days, but most of that time is just waiting for it to chill in the fridge.
Wait.
Oh, a little bit crispy.
Listen to that.
You're never going to get that from the supermarket.
That's interesting because usually when I eat these, they're kind of crispy.
Yeah.
These ones are crispy on the outside and still, like they've puffed so much, they're soft in the middle.
Yeah. That's so good.
Oh, so buttery.
Okay. The only thing about making puff pastry that is difficult is waiting for it to re-chill in the fridge. Really. The rolling it isn't that hard. The making the dough isn't that hard. Putting the butter in, not that hard. From a technical standpoint, this is a very easy project. It's just time. And knowing when to put it back in the fridge. So you can do a couple of folds, roll and fold, and put it back in. But if you're doing it for the first time, I would roll it, fold it, and put it back in the fridge. Don't get it too warm. That's the only thing.
I have a question.
Yep.
There was a lot of dough.
Oh.
That's not a lot of cookies.
No, so...
I feel like I've missed out on some projects.
I cut it into 3. 2 of them are in the freezer.
Oh, that's a good idea.
So you can use it, months from now. 1 is in the fridge, and it will be...
Something?
Sausage rolls in the next couple
Ooh.
days. Easy project. Easy-ish project.
If you have the time, it's an easy way to impress your friends.
It is. And you'll love them. Thanks for stopping by. See you again soon.